This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Shelby Varner with the K-State Radio Network. Gregg Hanzlicek, K-State veterinarian, begins today's show by talking about internal and external parasites and what cattle producers can do to fight them. Continuing the show is Brad White and Bob Larson from the Beef Cattle Institute at K-State as they discuss published research that talks about how biosecurity practices can impact cow-calf herds. As temperatures across Kansas continue to warm up, K-State Research and Extension horticulture agent for Riley County, Gregg Eyestone, says it's about time to plant warm season vegetables to end the show for today. That and more is coming up ahead on Agriculture Today. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we start our Thursday show talking about parasites in cattle. And in to talk about that, we're joined by K-State veterinarian in the diagnostic lab in the College of Veterinary Medicine, Gregg Hanzlicek. Gregg, thanks for joining us today.
My pleasure.
Gregg, as we are talking about parasites in cattle, first focusing on external parasites and specifically looking at flies.
Yep, so flies this time of year are the only external parasites we're concerned with. I mean, other parts of the year, lice, but lice season is December to March, so we can throw those. We don't have to worry about lice anymore. They don't like warm temperatures, and so we're talking about fly control. And on the bovine side, when we talk about fly control, it's primarily horn fly and hopefully a little bit of face fly control.
And as we're thinking about those horn flies, fly tags, something that producers might choose to use for them.
Yep, and the research has shown, or surveys, that most producers do use insecticide fly tags, which are effective against horn flies, a little bit with face flies. The recommendation is put tags in the adults. 2 tags are better than 1, so 1 in each ear. And then if it's in a geographical area where the producer has had problems with, say, face flies during the summer in the past, maybe use a tag in the baby calves. The other thing is, don't forget about our bulls. Our bulls carry a lot of flies, so we need to, if it's safe, to ear tag those bulls also before they go to pasture.
What type of fly tag should be put in?
Well, that's an important thing, is because we are seeing resistance flies to certain insecticides, especially the pyrethrins, and most people are going to use either an organophosphate or a pyrethroid insecticide. And really the way to reduce resistance, which means keep the tags effective, is to year 1 put a pyrethroid tag in, the next year put a pyrethroid tag in the ears, and then the third year switch over to an organophosphate. And when we say switching those chemicals, you can't tell by the name of the ear tag. You actually have to look on the back to see what the chemical is. So we're looking for pyrethroid or organophosphates, but it's P and O. P and O is really the rotation that's been shown to be the most effective, and at the same time reduce the amount of resistance of the flies.
As people are getting those cattle ready to be put out on pasture, there are a few different time recommendations for when that fly tag should be put in, but it's important to remember for a lot of cattle producers, time is money.
Exactly. So, some of these fly tags, they're as long as they live, or the effective date or how the duration is just a few months. So one of the recommendations is let's don't put them in now, because the peak of the fly season is months down the road, and kind of coordinate it to that. Most producers that I know are going to put the tags in today. But one of the things that producers can do as they get through the partial pasture season to see if their tags are still effective, if their external parasite program is effective, is to go and look to see how many horn flies are actually on the animals. And the number you hear is when you get to 200 per animal of horn flies, which are the flies on the backs and the sides. That's the economic threshold. Now, there isn't any producer that's going to go out and try to count flies, right? But there are some pretty cool pictures on the internet that show you the pattern that these flies will look like on the backs, depending on how many there are. So I recommend partway through the season, get the pictures off the internet, go out there and compare what you're seeing on your cows compared to these pictures, And that it just gives you a good idea of whether you need to add something to your fly control program or whether you don't. So it's just kind of a cool management thing that people can do.
And as we're talking about putting ear tags in, and while this is a few months out, it's really important that those ear tags come back out as well.
Absolutely. At the end of the season, we're talking about when the weaning occurs and the cows are taken away from the calves and vice versa. It's important that those insecticide ear tags are taken out and disposed appropriately, meaning they're not just laying around. And the reason that is important is at the end of the year, there's still some insecticide on those tags, but the level is so low that if any fly comes in contact with it, the only flies that are going to die are the ones that are the most susceptible to that insecticide. And so that means you're breeding the resistant ones and killing off the most susceptible ones. So to prevent resistance, taking those tags out every year before fall or during the fall and disposing them is really, really important.
And another option for possibly trying to control flies, maybe feeding something to them?
Yes, we call those pass-through, and they're either insect growth regulators or larvicides. Very, very effective. So those are products that will be in the mineral, and then the cow consumes them, the chemicals in the manure. It's only effective primarily against horn flies, some face flies, and that's because those two flies are flies that lay their eggs in the manure. Our horse flies, stable flies, deer flies, they do not use manure to lay their eggs, so it will have no effect against them, but they've been shown to be very effective against primarily the horn flies.
And when should producers be putting that out for their cattle?
This is the perfect time. Kind of the recommendation is at least 30 days prior to when the flies become an issue. So our recommendation is as soon as you go to pasture, right now would be a perfect time to start using those types of minerals that have those pass-through insecticides in them.
We've mentioned a few different ways to possibly control flies, but what other options are there that producers could look into?
Yeah, so if the producer goes out there and looks at his cows and says, partway through this program, it looks like our cows are carrying a heavy burden of horn flies in particular. They could put out back rubbers. They could use sprays. If they can get them in, they could use some topicals on them. They could do all those kind of things to enhance their fly control program.
And Gregg, wanting to transition to talking about internal parasites, and first off, thinking just about the difference between taking care of cows versus calves.
Yeah, so that's a great thing. So internal parasites, we can find those in every animal and every herd. But once a bovine gets to a year to year and a half of age, they have developed an immunity to the internal parasites or the worms. And yes, they do carry them, but they're going to keep the population of the internal parasites at a level that's not going to hurt them production-wise. It's the baby calves, their first exposure to the internal parasites. When they consume those are the animals that are going to actually take the hit for the internal parasites.
And really something important to think about for the cattle that are going out on pasture.
Yep. So we want to keep the pasture as clean as possible, meaning even though we know the adults are spreading the internal parasites through the manure, we would like to reduce those to a minimal level so that the baby calves that are out there grazing, their exposure to these internal parasites will be minimized.
And as we're talking about this, and we talked about with external parasites too, wanting to watch for resistance. And so what are some things that you're seeing maybe are having a bit of resistance now?
Yeah, we're starting to see with certain internal parasites some major resistance, especially to the ivermectins or avermectins. And so things like make sure that the proper dose. We don't want to underdose because it's kind of like the insecticide ear tag. If we underdose an animal, the only internal parasites we're killing are those that are most susceptible. So doing that, really probably the best way to get beyond resistance and also improve the internal parasite control program is to use two different types of dewormers. So when you hear people say a white dewormer, that's an oral dewormer in combination with either an injectable or a topical dewormer. Using those two types of products will reduce resistance and increase the effectiveness of the deworming program.
And as we've talked about all these different parasites, always a great reminder that your local veterinarian is a great person to talk to.
Absolutely. For any of these things, I would highly recommend that the producer talk to their veterinarian and say, what products are best for us? What timing do you guys or gals recommend as we go forward?
Gregg, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today.
You bet. My pleasure.
That was K-State veterinarian in the diagnostic lab in the College of Veterinary Medicine, Gregg Hanzlicek, as he talked about parasites, both external and internal, for cattle this time of year. Before we cut to a break, we're now going to be joined by USDA's Rod Bain and Agriculture Secretary Tom Vilsack, as he shares what he discussed with agricultural journalists on Monday about some of the challenges associated with Congress crafting a farm bill.
That a new farm bill has yet to be passed by Congress shows the multiple challenges faced in the process of drafting a farm bill and making it law. That, according to Agriculture Secretary Tom Vilsack, as he discussed some of those challenges with members of the North American Agricultural Journalist Organization Monday in Washington, D.C.
There's an issue concerning reference prices, specifically what reference prices get impacted and adjusted, how to pay for them. We know that there's a lot of conversation about improvements to crop insurance and how to create a structure that encourages more participation. Clearly, a lot of conversation as well about conservation and whether or not the investment in conservation of the IRA should remain in the IRA or should be placed within the Farm Bill, and placed within the Farm Bill whether or not it would continue to have a climate-smart focus or whether it would be open up for other uses.
Lawmakers have until September 30th to approve a new farm bill, as that is when the extension of the 2018 Farm Bill is set to expire. I'm Rod Bain reporting for the U.S. Department of Agriculture in Washington, D.C.
Once again, that was USDA's Rod Bain and U.S. Agriculture Secretary Tom Vilsack as he discussed the challenges associated with Congress crafting a farm bill. We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but stick around because we have more for you ahead. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we continue our Thursday show by extending our conversation talking about cattle herd health. However, this time we're joined by the Beef Cattle Institute's Brad White and Bob Larson as they discuss published research involving biosecurity practices in cow-calf herds.
The title of this one, and it was a paper published in 2021, Biosecurity Practices in Western Canadian Cow-Calf Herds and Their Association with Animal Health. And when they looked at, typical biosecurity things that people can do are to isolate incoming cattle, so cattle that you purchased. And in this study, same research group out of Canada, about 54% of herds purchased heifers, 42% purchased cows, about 30% would isolate incoming cattle away from the base herd for a period of time, and about 30% would also vaccinate those cattle to make sure that they are vaccinated prior to putting them with the rest of the herd. Now, some of the things that they looked at were, and they called an outbreak of disease. So an outbreak of scours or an outbreak of respiratory disease would be when you treated at least 10% of the calves, 10% of the herd. And so I think that's a good definition. A herd might treat one or two calves, and I don't know that raises the question of what should we do to prevent that. I'm really interested in preventing these outbreaks that are 10% or more of the herd. And, some of the things that they found there were that basically put cattle together. So communal grazing. So this is Western Canada, and they have a fair amount of multiple herds grazing the same ground. Well, that was an increased risk of both respiratory disease outbreaks and scours outbreaks. And basically, anytime they introduce new animals, the more contact with new animals, the greater the risk.
That echoes, Bob, especially when we think about respiratory disease. So Gregg Hanzlicek, who works here at the diagnostic lab, he did some work several years ago where he looked at both NOMS data and he did producer surveys. So one of the things that was found in those studies, and I didn't see it in this one, is if they did things like AI and creep feeding and things that would cause the animals, even with a broad pasture, to be closer together.
Right.
Or things like bringing in outside heifers or bringing in contact with feeder calves, outside contact, which is, I think, what you're saying here, also increase respiratory disease.
Yes. So one of the take-homes is, well, as a cattle rancher, in any situation, they're fairly spread out versus other, dairy cattle or feedlot cattle or swine or poultry. And so that's both an advantage, but also a disadvantage in that it's difficult to apply a lot of real strict biosecurity. Now, Some of the things that we can do are when we bring new animals in, doing the extra effort to separate them for a while and vaccinate them, make sure they're ready to go. This fits into the, why might some of these herds have greater risk? They found that having your winter feeding area be the same as the calving area increased the risk of respiratory disease in scours. So that makes sense. We tell people not to do that. Basically failing to get newborn calves out of the calving pasture as frequently. So some people tried to remove them within 1 day. Another option was kind of within 5 days or within 9 days or never. And herds that removed pairs as quickly as possible from the calving pasture had less disease risk in those calves. And basically, you and I have talked previously about the sandhill system, which is a very aggressive form of keeping young calves away from older calves and separating out those recently calved cows so that calves are not in contact with older calves. They saw that as a way to reduce the risk of navel ill and calf disease. So I'm more comfortable looking at some of these, what I would call biosecurity, getting age segregation, getting young calves so that they're not in contact with a dirty environment or other cattle as much as possible. It does point out that the adult cattle are the original source of the germs that are causing these disease.
Well, they'd have to be. Because it's the only place, it's the only thing that stays on the ranch.
And those adult cattle don't tend to get sick, right? And that's why we maybe sometimes don't think of them from the same biosecurity risk. But just like you said earlier, anytime we bring adults from different herds together, the calves are at greater risk. And maybe that's what I'm most comfortable saying.
Yeah, and some of the things that we're talking about, with all these papers, we talk about BRD, we talk about diarrhea, we're talking about infectious pathogens. And they're probably communicable to some degree.
Yes.
Because we talk about these outbreaks. Well, where do they get them to originate? It came from the cows from last year. And your thing on calving pastures, your thing on my ability to, and sometimes we leave or calve, even if it's a new calving pasture, we calve in an area that isn't as extensive as our summer grazing.
That's a very good point. And the authors of these papers point that out as well. And they even separated heifers from cows, and particularly heifers that were calved in a fairly small area. Their calves had more risk, and we know that. And that raises the question, why do people put heifers in a smaller area? Well, because I'm going to check them more frequently.
Increased observation.
Absolutely. And so there's trade-offs, and that's the important thing to understand about maybe biosecurity and cattle health in general is there are trade-offs, but you need to be aware of those, that when we gather heifers closer together so we can observe them more easily, we have increased the risk that their calves will get sick. And so we may need to consider that as we consider the optimum ways of managing the calving pastures.
But I think also it's important that, and we may have been remiss here, that's not what we found in some of our previous research, and I don't think it's what they found here, in that it's not that there's an average level across all herds.
Oh, good point.
You have some herds that have it and some that don't. They've said 1 in 5 on the BRD. Yeah. That's what we found on some of our other research, that an average of saying all herds have 5% respiratory disease, like we said earlier, can be very misleading because that's not what happens.
Many herds are zeros.
And some 10s and 20s.
Right. Yeah, and to me, it may be a better, and I like the way they pulled it out, was those herds where they treated 10% or more of the calves. Those are the herds that I'm actually kind of most interested in. And again, as any veterinarian or beef producer that's been in the business for a while will recognize is, well, those types of outbreaks are not common in one sense, in that it's not all the herds, as if I'm a veterinary practitioner, it's not all my clients' herds every year. It's not that at all. But it's not uncommon either, in that every year a few clients really have some scours outbreaks problems or summer pneumonia problems. And so maybe that's just a way to think about health in general, is it's not that we've got this constant level of disease risk and we're trying to lower it. It's the disease risk is oftentimes zero or pretty painful, and trying to get the number of times that it's pretty painful down to zero. And so, for instance, some of these things we talked about, having separate calving pastures and moving cattle quickly after birth, does that mean that if I don't, I'll have problems? Not necessarily, not this year, but over time I've increased my risk.
Maybe not. It depends what's in my herd. We just said these things may be in the herd, and they may be in all herds, But I would take the flip side of what you said, and I would say, if I have problems, I should probably pay attention to that sort of thing.
Yeah.
Right? If I'm not having problems, and however I'm doing it, I'm not going to come suggest a bunch of changes.
Right. Oh, so let's talk about one that was interesting. Was herds that vaccinated calves for respiratory disease early in life
Had higher risk.
had higher risk for respiratory disease. So there's obviously two potential conclusions. One is gathering calves to vaccinate them increases the risk of respiratory disease, which is possible. I can't discount that. Or herds that have had respiratory disease several times in the past
Tend to be more
apt to want to gather the calves to vaccinate them. And so, honestly, from a survey like this and a lot of research, it's really difficult to tell which one of those two things is happening here.
Now, we do know that some of these biosecurity factors can matter, but relatively few herds, 1 out of 3, based on their research, implement things like quarantine.
Correct.
Implement
Correct.
things that we know can offer some benefits. Now, does every herd need to do that? And I would, again, challenge, if I'm not having problems, maybe I don't need to do some of the on-farm things, but I still need to do, when I bring something outside to in, that does increase my risk. I think there's two different scenarios where, and we've sometimes said biosecurity and biocontainment. We're not using those words in this discussion, but that's really what we're talking about.
Well, and really, you look at kind of several papers, because there are these two papers out of Canada, and it's kind of the lab that Cheryl Waldner and John Campbell run. They kind of say similar things to some of the research that some of our previous grad students have done, and some work out of Mississippi State and some other in Nebraska and some other places that basically kind of point out the same thing. Commingling cattle from multiple herds increases the risk for calf disease. And I think we're pretty comfortable that makes sense.
So I think these are great things to think about as I go through the entire pre-weaning period, that I need to have some of that concerns for that potential infectious, potential communicative disease within my herd, from cows to calves or outside to in or calf to calf. So I appreciate you picking these papers for us to review and talk through, Bob.
That was the Beef Cattle Institute's Brad White and Bob Larson. You can hear more conversation on this by listening to the full Beef Cattle Institute's Bovine Science podcast. This episode is titled Herd Health, Pre-Weaning Disease in Herds. I will link it in today's show notes on agtoday.net, or you can also find it on the podcast streaming platform of your choice. We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but we'll be back with more ahead.
This is Agriculture Today. Along with Shelby Varner, I'm Jeff Wickman. With cool season vegetables already planted, it's time to start thinking about warm season vegetables, including beans, corn, and eggplant. K-State Research and Extension Horticulture Agent for Riley County, Gregg Eyestone, says the soil temperature in your area is what determines the best time for planting warm season vegetables. Greg, we're kind of at that time where we're thinking about maybe a second planting of some of the cooler crops, but we're also thinking ahead towards some of the warm season crops as well. What can we still get in the ground right now?
Yeah, so if you haven't got some beets or carrots in the ground, you can still do that. There'll be time for them to mature before it gets really hot and their quality starts to deteriorate. You may have already planted lettuce and radishes, and those grow pretty quickly, and so therefore you can plant another planting of that so you can extend your harvest until we get to the really warm part of the summer when they aren't going to be doing very well, and you'll fill that space in with something else, or a warm season vegetable probably.
As we think about the warm season vegetables, we really need probably the soil temperature to maybe warm up a little bit more?
That's correct. Typically on our vegetables, we really want to plant them at the peak of planting time, and so they don't have some delay. Sometimes that creates some issues in the development of the plants. If we can wait till the temperature's adequate for growth, that would probably be preferred. Some people like to get a little bit of head start on that. There are ways you can kind of warm the soil up, particularly thinking about tomatoes if you're wanting to get those in the ground. Oftentimes we use some type of plastic mulch that will warm that soil up. You're exactly right. It's soil temperatures that we really need to focus on, and anything probably 50 degrees or lower is not probably conducive to our warm season vegetables. 60 would be even better for planting times, but sometimes we have the time and want to get it in the ground. Check the Mesonet or check out your soil temperatures and see where they're at. I checked the computer system there, and they go up and down. They were 50 a couple days ago, but this morning when I checked, it was a little bit cooler in the 40s, a little bit high 40s, and so it may be a little early for planting some of our vegetables. You may be thinking about planting some corn. I know some farmers are planting corn in the fields. We have some different genetics in our sweet corns. Maybe the older-fashioned sugar sweet type of corns can be planted. They tolerate the cooler temperatures, will germinate. But a lot of people like the super sweets, the SH2. If you look on a seed packet, it may have that reference. And those really do need warmer temperatures for good germination. Gardeners like to experiment and like to try, push the envelope, if you will, so you can try some of the others. But just be aware that the normal sweet corn can be planted a little bit earlier than, say, the super sweet type of sweet corns.
What about in terms of container planting? Does that make a difference because you have less soil?
Yeah, it depends on your growing media that you put in there. But, you can definitely grow a lot of our vegetables, maybe not corn. That's not too practical. But potatoes, tomatoes, peppers, a lot of those kinds of vegetables can be grown in a container. And you can modify the growing conditions a little bit with those containers. The only challenge with them is the limited moisture retention. And so you do want good drainage in the soil, so you don't want a heavy clay soil or maybe something out of the garden. We prefer the growing medias that you can purchase and put in there for better root development. But your frequency of watering is going to be different on container gardening.
Herbs are also a possibility, and those a lot of times can just be done on kind of a windowsill.
Herbs probably should be in a container because sometimes they can take over different areas of the garden depending on what you're growing. A lot of people love basil, which I would tie in with tomatoes, would probably need a little warmer environment. Of course, you can maybe move that container so you can put it out in sunny days, and if it's going to be cool, bring it into the garage or something like that to protect it. So there are different ways gardeners manage the environment that Kansas throws at us.
And Extension has a number of publications that really talk about specific dates and soil temperatures and all of that for the various vegetables.
That's a great point. The Kansas Garden Guide is one reference, and a publication kind of pulled out of there is the Vegetable Garden Planting Guide, and that does have soil temperatures, recommendations on that. You just need your soil thermometer or use the computer system and check out those temperatures for proper planting times.
That's K-State Research and Extension Horticulture Agent for Riley County, Gregg Eyestone. The Kansas Garden Guide is available online and through the Extension bookstore. And that'll do it for this edition of Agriculture Today. For Shelby Varner, I'm Jeff Wickman. This is the K-State Radio Network.